didn't think I had any reason not to trust the school district.
My son was being discriminated against at school.
Paying attention to the four eyes of oppression. It just made my daughter feel uncomfortable to do this assignment and to say these particular things.
They were going to tell my daughter that I'm unsafe, and they would deem me a threat.
Right over there. It's not good enough just not to be racist anymore. Now you have to be an activist.
I think a lot of families across the country are having the same kinds of issues when it comes to this stuff.
This is not an isolated incident.
And we just got so doggone many calls from parents saying that this sort of thing's happening to their kids.
Oh, I'm very worried. So should every parent be.
This is nothing new. I experienced, I saw it before. Another time, another place.
A lot of people who have come here from China have been ringing the alarm.
We're talking about ideology. Ideology of how to divide people.
Oftentimes, these parents and citizens find themselves vilified, demonized, and silenced.
You're pitting family member against family member when you do that.
Americans need to be aware that there are people who are intent on changing our system, of changing how we're constituted as a nation.
It aims to disrupt America's very nature, this very idea that we are a place of freedom and opportunity and equality.
I think it's more about being critical of our current system, of our way of life.
Not to reform it or remedy it, but to completely transform it.
They don't see the world in terms of being a part of a civic community. They can be victorious only through conflict. There's no room for compromise.
They're really taking away our freedom of speech and our freedom of thoughts.
They want to get rid of the systems that protect our rights, and they don't really care what they're replaced with. They simply want to tear down the system as it stands. Now, you can see this spreading across multiple disciplines, particularly in the education context.
As a parent, I don't want my child to think that your skin color is the most defining feature of your life.
You know, it's hard for me to explain to my kids that one part of themselves is oppressed by another part of themselves.
They're violating my son's civil rights, no way. They're violating my civil rights, no way.
That is the time that I have to make a big decision.
When I figured out that there was nobody else that was going to step forward and do this, I said, if not me, then who, right?
I started looking for anybody who would help. Anybody who would listen.
You need to speak up about it. Shine sunlight on it.
These parents, they are exercising their freedom of speech, their freedom of expression. They wanted accountability. They wanted transparency.
I'm going to exercise my rights and my freedoms, and I'm going to speak freely when I choose to, and my kids will too.
We inspired a movement. We inspired parents all across the country to speak up, to make their voices heard.
The invasion of critical race theory is through diversity.
We were all doing distance learning. All the children in the pandemic were just having the hardest time trying to cope with being isolated at home. My children were no different. My name is Gabrielle Clark, and I fight indoctrination in the K through 12 setting. My daughter, we were supposed to have a normal, regular family. And now it's just me and her. And so we had to leave my sons behind. They're grown-ups. But, I had never planned on living, 1,000 miles away from my kids. But I felt like that's what we did. We had to flee, Nevada. I'm from Houston. I hadn't lived here in 20 some odd years, and I hadn't had any real plans of coming back here. But when all of this started happening, I had to put my daughter in a place where I knew she would be rooted in reality. So we moved back to Houston so I could recapture my daughter. My daughter was sad a lot of the time, and so I spent a lot of time with her. I got to listen, or really more so overhear, what was happening in her classes. She was taking an art class, and the teacher was telling them that graffiti was a form of expression for the Black Lives Matter movement. I wasn't okay with someone describing crimes to my middle schooler as an appropriate form of expression. I wasn't okay with someone giving my daughter essentially permission to spray paint a car to vent her frustrations about social ills. And there are social ills, but that's not the appropriate way to express your thoughts on that, especially describing it to a middle schooler. So I started listening more intently at what was going on in her classrooms, and I heard a teacher say something about the murder of Black people by the police. And that was inappropriate, especially since the subject matter wasn't even, I don't even think that they were discussing history in any capacity. So I just told my daughter, I said, shut that computer. And I found her another school that day.
What happened with me is my daughter came to me and told me that she was uncomfortable doing one of the assignments for her European history class. The assignment had to do with anti-Asian violence in the United States. Yeah, my name is Stuart, and I am a father of two kids in Poway Unified School District in San Diego. I'm a little bit sensitive to racial comments like that because I'm a mixed race guy. My mom is white. My dad is or was half Black. The majority of my family is Black. The majority of my living family, especially extended family. My kids are mixed with 3 different races. Part white, Black, and they're part Vietnamese as well. The assignment for her and the kids in the class were to make slides and do a presentation on anti-Asian crimes or violent crimes against Asians. I didn't really know what that had to do with European history. I have the slides, and based on the information that was given to them in class and the teaching from their instructor, what their goal was to find who the perpetrators, the bystanders, and who the upstanders were in anti-Asian violent crimes. They found, or based on their slides anyway, it showed white people and Donald Trump were the perpetrators of violent crimes against Asians.
Oh my God.
Not were responsible for or played a part in, but were the actual perpetrators. of violent crimes against Asians. I actually did research into every single one of the incidents that was in the news articles and the news stories. And I found that every single one of the perpetrators, and looking at photos, videos, all that stuff is available. All that information is available. And everyone except for one incident was perpetrated by someone that was black, which is something that I have to say is negative for me as well, being a biracial person myself. I mean, it's all about CRT. It's all CRT.
Critical race theory is a worldview that believes that your skin color is the most important thing about you, that race is the only way to describe public and private life. It is a worldview because it's not just a philosophy that is meant to describe things around us. It is meant to be put into practice. Critical race theorists themselves say that critical race theory has an applied dimension. It's meant to be used. I'm Jonathan Butcher, the Will Skillman Fellow in Education at the Heritage Foundation. So our focus in education policy is giving parents the ability to choose how and where their children learn. I mean, we believe that parents know their children best and they know their children's needs, and so we want them to be able to choose whether it's educating them at home or choosing a private school or a public charter school or their assigned public school, that they should have that choice. In order to make that choice valuable, we have to protect those in traditional public schools from racial discrimination, right? Which is the natural outcome of critical race theory, for example. We have to protect private schools from the same thing by giving them the autonomy to, choose how they operate and protect their ability to decide how to provide an education. I wrote Splintered because there were so many myths out there today about what critical race theory actually was and what it causes. I felt it was necessary to answer whether or not America is systemically racist. And the answer is no.
I was a young dad of 3 amazing kids. I was finally
to Germany in the 1920s, where a group of frustrated Marxists who were disappointed that Marxism and the socialist revolution was not successful in Germany, they decided that they needed to take Marxism to a new place beyond just this conflict between economic classes, and they wanted to inject Marxism into culture and into society.
Why can't we make this happen in the rest of Europe? Why can't we make it happen in America? And the conclusion was we just haven't marketed it properly. I'm Alexander Haberbush, president of the Lex Rex Institute and a practicing constitutional attorney. Now, Lex Rex is Latin for the law is king, because the law is still our king in this country. So the laws are crafted such that it's in a lot of circumstances, it's very difficult to sue a school district for what they're teaching. Now, we're very creative and clever about finding openings there where we can sue. We've been very successful on those lawsuits. We've taken a lot of cases that have to do with critical race theory in schools, kids being taught ideas of critical race theory. We've been challenging that in school districts throughout this state and throughout this country. And we've seen critical race theory just laying waste to rights of kids in school districts. And people can look and they say, I got a California pen, I'm a California lawyer, what do I expect? It's not just California, it's across the country. So the thing that nobody will tell you about Marxism is that there were a lot of other kinds of socialism before Marx and Engels. Socialism was popular at the times. So what did Marx and Engels do differently that allowed it to take off? Well, they capitalized on a few things that were popular at the time. First of those things was science. Nothing was worth anything unless it was scientific. So scientific, let's call it scientific socialism. And he did that, and he created a whole dialectical framework for it. It comprehended the totality of life. It economized every aspect of human dealing. Great, it's a neat package. You understand everything through the lens of Marxism.
And so a group of academics, they called themselves the Frankfurt School eventually, they formed in Germany. And by 1937, when the Nazis were in power, they chased these Marxists out of the country, and they landed at Columbia University in the United States. And that's where they became embedded in higher education in the U.S.
Oh, now we know the truth.
Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, and others, they began developing this notion that Marxism is not just about economics, that it is really about revolutionizing culture and changing the way that we discuss the nature of society, not as something where people are looking for civil and civic relationships, but it is always a struggle for power. It is always a struggle between individuals of different groups. And they developed that into what we know as critical theory.
So Horkheimer was the one that writes the essay, the first essay that names critical theory. My name is Mike Gonzalez. I am the Angeles T. Arredondo Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. I've been paying attention to CT, critical theory, for a very long time. Marcuse, Horkheimer, for years I've been writing about it. I think my job is to expose them, to explain the origins, to explain the ideological content that is, what is their intention. I quote them, unlike the media who does not quote them. I quote them constantly. I quote the people who train them. I shine a spotlight on them. Marxism has gone through different stages. They have the Marxists of today have abandoned the idea of a bloody revolution, in which the proletariat kills the bourgeois, rapes his wife and daughters, and then there's a lot of bloodletting in the streets. What we have now is a quiet revolution. I was born in one of them, in the craziest of revolutions, a Cuban one. I lived there until the age of 12. It was communism at its peak, and revolution at its peak. So I saw all of that in my first 12 years, but I have also lived in South Korea. I have lived in Belgium for close to 6 years. I lived in France. I lived in Spain as a kid as well for 2 years. So I'm able to compare and contrast, and I'm able to say with certitude, the United States has lots of problems, obviously, but it's still the best hope for man on earth, as Lincoln said. Otherwise, people would not be flocking here by the millions. Antonio Gramsci writes in the 20s and 30s, but he doesn't really become influential until the late 60s and 70s. What Gramsci said is that in some society you need to have a war of positions. In other words, you need to infiltrate the institutions, indoctrinate people. Is what you need to achieve the quiet revolution. And so the ideas of Antonio Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse and Max Horkheimer, I think you can say that they fuse in the 1960s and 70s and produce the thinking that we're dealing with today.
Their technical way of describing this was updating Marxism for 20th century problems. And the way they went about that was basically to invent different flavors of Marxism.
That is where all sorts of evolutions of feminism, of gender ideology, of critical legal theory, all developed out of that.
We have deeply deindustrialized to begin with, but even in the 60s, when we were still heavily industrialized, the industrial worker has zero interest in revolution. He just wanted to improve his lot in life, and did. That really upset Marcuse and Horkheimer, that the worker was such a bad revolutionary. everybody was looking for a substitute proletariat. Marcuse very famously writes the ghetto population, and he writes in another essay, is going to be people of other races and other colors that are going to be the revolutionary agents.
So the next name you've got to know when looking at this stuff is Michael Foucault. He makes it psychological. So oppression now becomes a psychological phenomenon, being made to feel badly about something. And this really dovetails with the work of Antonio Gramsci. What he's doing in his theory is explicitly doing away with the doctrine of materialism that orthodox Marxism holds to, and instead bringing in this idea of lived experience, which becomes very prevalent in critical race theory. And the real contribution that Foucault makes is that he conceives of institutions as such, as instruments of oppression. Because critical race theory, remember, brings in all of these things about systemic racism. That's looking at the system as such as an instrument of oppression. So it's no longer the oppression that needs to stop. It's not the people who are responsible. It's the system as such that is perpetuating oppression, and importantly, oppression that cannot be shown because it's oppression that is experienced psychologically.
In the 70s, you had a group of legal scholars. They thought that it was the law had been written by the powerful and the rich to keep their power and to keep their wealth, and they took it upon themselves to sabotage trust in the law, to undermine the trust in the law that the American population had, and without which the system collapses, right?
Critical legal theorists said that America needed to be taken apart, either piece by piece or all at once.
The next flavor of Marxism they tried is the one that we're interested in, and that's race-flavored Marxism.
Critical race theory evolved out of critical legal theory because they said it's not just American law that is systemically oppressive. The issue here is race.
And this is where things really start to get off the rails, because once you've identified a certain group of people who are not disadvantaged as a result of their circumstances, but disadvantaged as a result of who they are, their skin color, who they were born, oppression is no longer about material circumstances, but perceived inadequacy.
And so, by the end of the 1980s, you have the formation of this new development out of critical theory. And the belief was that your skin color, race, matters more than anything else. That is the defining feature of society.
The man who is recognized by all as the godfather of critical race theory, that is Derek Bell, who taught law at Harvard, said that if we're going to revolutionize a culture, we have to start by a radical assessment of it, by criticizing it, critical assessment of it. And that's what critical race theory does. It wants to revolutionize America.
By the time the 1990s moved into the 2000s, this is when we begin to talk about how critical race theory was changing policy. So we begin to see critical race theory analyze policy by saying that any policy, any law, any rule, any program that creates different outcomes must be racist. That's the only explanation that critical race theorists have.
They're obsessed by the disparities, the racial disparities. Their point, one of their main points, is that the existence of the disparities is evidence, is proof that America suffers from systemic racism. For example, they say, well, there's a huge racial disparity between Black Americans and white Americans. But if you subdivide that and you look at, for example, Black Americans of Ghanaian descent, it's also true for Americans of Nigerian descent.
And they sort of have to go this route of psychologizing oppression because the statistics just don't bear out what they're saying.
And so they're not interested in adhering to our founding ideals or adhering to the idea of justice under the law. They want to work outside it and say that instead we're going to take culture to a radical place where it's not about equality under the law, it's about equity. It's about equal outcomes. So they're not arguing that we should be looking for ways to unite society. They're saying that there really should be different rights afforded to different people based on skin color. And they want to force those outcomes. I mean, it's the only way that you can have equity is through coercion. So that's how we arrived really in the early 1990s with this new concept of critical race theory that traces its roots easily back to the Marxists of the 1920s.
I went to my son and I asked him if anything like that was happening in his class. And he told me no, because he didn't think they were related. But I did have this thing happen. I said, okay, well, what? And he said, there was a SpongeBob meme. And I said, okay, what did you say? And he said, I just said, anybody can be racist. The teacher cut the chat. And that was the end of that. So I went into his study area and saw what was on the screen. And they were definitions of conservative and liberal. But the description that it gave didn't represent conservatism. And quite frankly, that definition didn't accurately and fairly describe what a liberal is either. Both of the definitions seemed skewed to me negatively. All of the slides and all of the definitions and descriptions of words that we know as one thing were interpreted in a completely and totally different way. I was just shocked. I was shocked that this is supposed to be a civics class, and almost everything was about social justice. I looked at some of the assignments, and one of the assignments he was supposed to complete. He got about halfway through. They were asking race, religion, sexual orientation. Do you have any disabilities? So I talked to my son. I said, why didn't you finish this assignment? And he just kind of shrugged, And I said, you didn't finish this assignment because it's wrong. And moreover, it's against the law.
And what I did was after looking at these slides, I wanted to see what data they were using to get this information. It was basically a couple of news stories, some anecdotal stories, some information from some activist groups. And what I did next was I talked to the teacher about this information, and I wanted to know why she was using just anecdotal information without any empirical data or objective evidence or anything like that. And she basically told me that these news stories from USA Today, the USA Today was a trusted source, and they were an unbiased source of this data. Come to find out, the very next day, interestingly enough, there was a race and inclusion editor for USA Today. The very next day, that was fired for bias. Right, I mean, you can't make it up.
You can find the words critical race theory not only in curriculum, but frankly being defended by educators. I mean, the superintendent of Detroit Public Schools was asked recently, and there's a video on YouTube of this superintendent saying, yes, critical race theory is most certainly in their curriculum.
Our curriculum is deeply using critical race theory, especially in social studies, but you'll find it in English language arts and the other disciplines.
The words critical race theory can be found in a memo released by the Hayward Unified School District, just outside of San Francisco, where they were told their school community just 2 years ago that they would make sure critical race theory remained a part of their curriculum as a part of the state's ethnic studies program. There is in Portland Public Schools a set of YouTube videos that is a part of a critical race theory working group that the school district had. The words critical race theory were in a teacher training program that was provided to educators in Loudoun County, Virginia, and on and on.
It started with my friend being put on a blacklist by the anti-racist parents of Loudoun County. They put a list of parents to be targeted for allegedly being against critical race theory. And they wanted to expose these people publicly. They wanted to hack websites. They wanted to infiltrate, shut down businesses. It was just horrible what they were trying to do. So these are the two letters that were sent to my law firm. I'm Jessica Mendez, and I'm a paralegal by my profession, but I'm also a mom.
When you look at TV networks in America, a soundbite and fight-it-out culture prevails on news and commentary programs. As a Canadian, I'm fascinated with America, and I wanted to offer American thought leaders an opportunity to share their thoughts in a deep-dive format where we can explore their ideas together. And so American Thought Leaders was born. The world's most brilliant thinkers believed that open discourse was the key to greatness. However, all around the world, we see that discourse is being stifled, and political agendas have subverted media. The Epoch Times launched its Global Thought Leaders program to bring back this great tradition of free thought. As the host of American Thought Leaders, every week I interview some of the most intriguing minds on the most pressing issues of our time. Be sure to check out our new episodes every week.
From our New York headquarters.